For Damascus, the capitulation came with a side serving of humiliation. Besides being a strategic asset, Syria's chemical stockpile also was a closely guarded state secret and one that carried the additional stigma of being banned under international law. Assad had never acknowledged possessing nerve agents. Now he was confessing, renouncing, and surrendering all at once. It could be likened to asking Israel, an undeclared nuclear weapons state that does not officially acknowledge the existence of its estimated 80 to 400 nuclear bombs and missiles, to suddenly pull back the curtain on its entire nuclear arsenal and then invite outsiders to come in and trash everything: the missiles, the warheads, even its heavily guarded nuclear reactor. But for Assad and for Russia, this was the price for forestalling a US airstrike and postponing the collapse of Assad's regime, even if just for a little while, and Assad was willing to pay. For the Obama administration, it was the political equivalent of a Houdini act. The White House had somehow managed to simultaneously delay a military strike and avoid the humiliation of its failure to win congressional support for one. The idea of a grand US Russian bargain to eliminate Syria's weapons stockpile had been floating around for months in very different settings. Richard Lugar, the Indiana senator and arms control advocate, publicly proposed such a deal during a visit to Moscow in July 2012, and Andy Weber mentioned it afterward in Pentagon meetings. The idea piqued the interest of then Deputy Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who, like Weber, had worked with Russians in the 1990s to secure Soviet era nuclear and chemical weapons. After that, US and Russian diplomats and military officials kicked the idea around in a series of private meetings in Moscow and Washington without reaching any firm conclusions. Meanwhile, the same thought had occurred to the Israeli government. Immediately following the Ghouta attack, Israeli Minister of Intelligence Yuval Steinitz summoned Russia's ambassador to his office to ask about Syria's weapons. This is becoming an embarrassment for you, Steinitz said, referring to Syria's latest international outrage. According to a participant in the meeting, why don't you force Syria to get rid of them? A few days after that, an Israeli businessman conveyed the idea privately to a White House official as the Obama administration was struggling to line up votes for its planned airstrike. Yet, to many US officials who were aware of the proposal, it seemed like a fantasy. And so it remained up to the moment that Syria's biggest champion, Vladimir Putin, decided that this most improbable of ideas might have merit. On September 6, Syria's weapons came up during a brief exchange between Putin and Obama at the G20 summit in the Russian city of St. Petersburg. The two leaders met privately without senior aides present, but afterward Obama told advisers that he had suggested the two countries find a way to work together. Putin, clearly anxious to stave off a possible US airstrike, appeared to listen. You shouldn't do this, the Russian leader had said, referring to the planned attack on Syria. I've been trying to talk to you about the chemical weapons issue since you were re-elected, Obama said. If you would solve this problem, I wouldn't have to strike. Putin made no commitments but said He would have Lavrov call, according to Obama's account of the discussion. 3 days later, Secretary Kerry was holding a press conference in London when a reporter asked a theoretical question. What could Syria possibly do to avoid a US military strike? Kerry's answer was equally theoretical. Assad could save himself only if he were to voluntarily give up his entire arsenal. He could turn over every single bit of his chemical weapons to the international community in the next week. Turn it over, all of it, without delay, and allow a full and total accounting for that, Kerry said, but he's not about to do it. That afternoon, during the flight back to Washington, his press spokeswoman went to considerable effort to tamp down suggestions that Kerry had been hinting about a strategy change. This is not a change in policy, the official insisted to reporters traveling with the Secretary of State. But Russian diplomats who watched the exchange saw an opening. Before Kerry's flight landed at Joint Base Andrews in the Washington suburbs, a call from Moscow came through on the plane's secure line. It was Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and Kerry's friend and occasional diplomatic sparring partner. I saw your comments, Lavrov began. There was a strong chance, he said, that Syria was prepared to accept America's terms. Just 72 hours later, Kerry and Lavrov would be on their way to Geneva to test, over 3 days of talks, whether the impossible notion of a Syrian disarmament could be transformed into something real. To prepare for the talks, calls went out to lawyers, intelligence analysts, weapons experts, and Syria specialists spread across a half dozen agencies with instructions to be ready to travel to Switzerland within 24 hours. The initial instructions were vague, as there was no real precedent for what the experts were being asked to do. The word from Moscow was that Assad had privately consented to signing on to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the act of signing would trigger a number of legal obligations, including a requirement to declare and destroy any weapons Syria possessed and to submit to international inspections by the Convention's enforcement body, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW. Beyond that, no one knew what to expect or how the meeting's lofty goals might be accomplished.